President Obama's administration has brought about change. I don't think that can be debated. There is everything from the symbolic to the substantive, levels of what it would mean to have an African American president. And I think at the same time, there have been changes that were unanticipated that came as a consequence of his presidency. And so when we talk about the initial moment of his launch into as a national political figure, which was in that 2004 convention speech in Boston, he began that by saying, there's not a Black America or a white America or a Latino America, but there's the United States of America. And, that was entirely untrue. There were vastly different realities that very often corresponded to race, or at least were significantly correlated with race and ethnicity. And so what we've seen over the course of his 2 terms has been a means by which, or a period in which, has been increasingly visible. The distinctions that we see as citizens based upon these elements of identity, who we are and where we're from and what kind of communities we live in and what our racial or ethnic background is, those things have come to the foreground. And I don't think that you could possibly have anticipated the extent to which they have done so. And so when we look at Black Lives Matter and how it emerged, one, it seemed kind of paradoxical that for half a century, African Americans have been struggling specifically around the Voting Rights Act to get increased political electoral representation. And at the point at which we're represented at the pinnacle of American political power, it reverberates in this kind of a boomerang effect, and we wind up with a revitalized grassroots movement of people who don't necessarily trust political power, people who are outside the establishment, and people who are attempting to kind of move the levers of political power to the advantage of disempowered communities. And one would have thought, I guess in a kind of naive perspective on Barack Obama's presidency, you would have thought that those things would not have been necessary. Certainly some of his critics thought that he was going to govern in such a radical way that there was going to be reparations handed out in the first week for African Americans. And he's been very moderate and centrist and often reluctant to directly engage issues of race. And I think that's where some of the frustration had come from the younger generation of activists. And they took his moderation as being, in some instances, inadequate to the task at hand. I think that there's a lot that's missing from the public conversation about race. When we talk about race, we most often confront it as an emotional reality, or this kind of subject of social anxiety, or something in which we go, oh, we're really all the same, and it's a ridiculous idea that we separate ourselves in this way, which is true, but it's also a very facile way of approaching that question, because on a more fundamental level, race is a mythology, but is also a very useful myth. And that's been the only way it's been able to endure for as long as it has, particularly in the United States. And so what I mean by that is we look at things now, when we talk about race, we tend to say that there's a level of mistrust, or there's stereotypes or misunderstandings, and we have these problems and we should all just look at each other as humans. But the fact of the matter is that things like slavery and segregation and economic discrimination, these things happened willfully. They weren't the result of kind of haphazard, mistaken approaches to people who happen to be different from you. And so it means that we don't simply have to dispel mythology. It means we have to actually grapple with people having concrete interests that may be different than the interests of other communities. And so it's not simply implicit bias in policing that has resulted in disproportionate numbers, as we saw in Ferguson. It wasn't simply a matter of implicit bias or stereotypes or good, intentioned, well-intentioned individuals who happen to have arrested or pulled over more African Americans than whites, we saw that there was an institutional, structural approach to particular communities that were being fleeced by a police department. And so we can find those kind of dynamics again and again and again. And so when we talk about race, it's going to be much more intractable than simply ridding ourselves of maybe some mistaken ideas that have rattled around in our heads for some time.